5 names: Spain, France, England, Germany, Italy, the reigning world champions. Some of the most successful football nations the game has ever seen. Now imagine all 5 saying exactly the same thing to FIFA. We're not coming to the 2030 World Cup. Not as a threat, not as a negotiating tactic, as a formal decision. And those 5 weren't even the biggest story, because it wasn't just 5 countries walking away. It was all 55 UEFA member nations, unanimously. So what could possibly make the most powerful confederation in world football decide the World Cup itself was no longer worth attending? Title card: This is the story of the week football came closer than ever to selling its soul, and then refused. The proposal earlier this week, FIFA President Gianni Infantino unveiled something extraordinary. Not a rumor, not a leaked document, a public proposal. The idea was to create a new commercial company called FIFA Forward Enterprise and move the commercial rights for the World Cup, along with FIFA's biggest tournaments, into it. Then FIFA would sell around 20% of that company to private investors in a deal reportedly worth about $20 billion. The lead investor? A fund linked to Joshua Kushner, founder of Thrive Capital and brother of Jared Kushner. In other words, a private investment fund with close ties to the White House would end up owning a permanent share of the biggest sporting event on the planet. Infantino presented it as a win for everyone. Approved the plan by September 19, he told FIFA's 211 member associations, and the money would flow back into football. According to FIFA, each association could receive more than $80 million over the next decade, with much more funding for smaller nations. On paper, that sounds attractive, but there was one huge problem. The confederations hadn't been consulted beforehand. The proposal arrived looking almost finished, and they were given just 6 weeks to decide. The reaction: if there's one thing football's governing bodies don't like, it's being handed a completed plan and told to sign off on it. UEFA reacted almost immediately. An emergency meeting involving all 55 European associations was called. More than 50 delegates spoke. When the meeting ended, the result was unanimous. Europe would boycott not only the 2030 World Cup, but every FIFA competition for as long as the proposal remained on the table. They didn't just want the deal cancelled. They wanted FIFA to guarantee that its tournaments would never again be open to private ownership. One sentence summed up the entire argument. The World Cup cannot be treated as an investment product. That's really what this fight is about. To Infantino, the World Cup is an incredibly valuable asset. To everyone else, it's something that was never meant to be sold. The stakes a European boycott wouldn't just be symbolic. Take away Spain, France, England, Germany, Italy, Portugal, the Netherlands, Croatia, and dozens of other nations. And it's hard to argue you're still watching a true World Cup. The value investors are being asked to pay billions for disappears almost overnight. And the impact would start much sooner than 2030. The Women's World Cup in Brazil in 2027, youth tournaments, women's qualifiers. The first people caught in the middle would be players who had absolutely nothing to do with the decision. Critics already have a name for that, turning women's football into a bargaining chip. Then the pressure spread. CONCACAF, with its 41 member nations, including the 3 hosts of the 2026 World Cup, rejected the proposal as well, saying the process had been rushed and lacked proper consultation. Soon after, Asia joined them. The AFC, usually one of Infantino's strongest supporters, called for a full review of how FIFA makes decisions this significant. Do the maths. 55 European members, 41 from CONCACAF, 47 from Asia. More than 140 of FIFA's 211 associations were now against the proposal. At that point, the numbers simply weren't there anymore. The dominoes start to fall, then came the resignations. Carlos Cordero, one of Infantino's senior advisors and FIFA's representative on the White House task force for the 2026 World Cup, stepped down in protest. He also urged others inside football to speak out. Suddenly, people started talking about something that seemed impossible only weeks earlier. A serious challenger to Infantino in next year's FIFA presidential election. And this isn't the first time. Back in 2021, Infantino pushed the idea of holding the World Cup every 2 years. Europe threatened a boycott. The proposal disappeared. He expanded the tournament to 48 teams. Now there are already discussions about taking it to 64 teams by 2030. The pattern is becoming familiar. Big decisions are announced from the top, while everyone else finds out at the same time as the public. A fair point. To be fair, FIFA's argument isn't completely without merit. The organization says the money would be reinvested into football, especially in smaller federations that don't have Europe's financial strength. And it's true that private investment has transformed parts of club football, sometimes with positive results. It's also fair to say Europe's biggest associations aren't completely neutral either. Their influence is on the line. There's a real conversation to be had about how football should be funded and how the game's wealth should be shared. But that's not what brought this proposal crashing down. What did was this. FIFA had just overseen the most profitable World Cup in history and was already sitting on record financial reserves. Yet it still decided to sell part of its biggest asset. A $20 billion deal, rushed through in 6 weeks, involving a fund linked to the family of the U.S. president, without first consulting the confederations. For many people, it wasn't just what FIFA was trying to sell. It was the way they tried to do it. The World Cup doesn't belong to Gianni Infantino. It doesn't belong to FIFA's boardroom, and it certainly doesn't belong to a private equity fund. It belongs to the fans who paint their faces every 4 years, to the small nations that spend years chasing one qualification dream, and to the players who leave everything on the pitch. FIFA's job is to protect the game. This week, many people felt it tried to sell part of it instead, and more than 140 member nations stood together and said no. Infantino believed the money would convince everyone. Instead, he found himself facing the biggest political backlash of his presidency. Now the question is what happens next. Does FIFA quietly back away? Does Infantino fight to keep the proposal alive? Or has this become the biggest own goal in football politics?